Elizabeth Carter did not weep when her husband failed to come home that night. She sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, and made a decision so quiet it didn't even stir the air. By morning, she had already begun. Not revenge, not rage. Something far more dangerous, she simply stopped pretending. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of July the 14th, 1817, arrived the way most summer mornings did in the Virginia lowlands, slow and golden with the kind of heat that settled into a person's bones before they even rose from bed. Nathaniel Carter rode up the long dirt lane toward Carter's Hollow just past 6 in the morning. His horse, a dark bay stallion named Garrison, moved at an easy walk. Nathaniel didn't push him. There was no reason to hurry. He'd been away from the house before. Many times. It never mattered. He was a man who owned 460 acres of some of the finest tobacco land in all of Albemarle County. He had a brick house with 8 rooms, 2 staircases, and a parlor that the wives of lesser men spoke about with poorly concealed envy. He had a name that carried weight from the courthouse steps all the way to the tavern on Mill Road. Nathaniel Carter didn't need to hurry for anything or anyone. He tied Garrison to the post at the side gate and walked to the front entrance, brushing road dust from his sleeve. He reached into his breast pocket for his key, fit it to the lock, and turned. It didn't move. He tried again. Nothing. He stepped back, looked up at the house, then tried once more, slower this time, as though the lock might simply need a moment to remember him. The key turned a quarter inch and stopped cold like it had met something immovable on the other side. Nathaniel Carter stood there on the front step of his own house in the full light of the morning, unable to get through his own front door. He didn't knock immediately. Men like Nathaniel Carter did not knock on their own doors. But after a long moment, after it became clear that the lock had not made an error, that the key had not changed, that the door was simply genuinely locked against him, he raised his fist and knocked 3 times. Silence. He knocked again. Harder. The sound of footsteps reached him from inside. Slow, measured footsteps. Not the quick shuffle of a housemaid. Not the heavy tread of a laborer. These were the deliberate steps of a man who had decided exactly how fast he intended to walk before he'd even left the room. The door opened. Samuel Hayes stood in the entrance. 55 years old, white-haired, with a face that had been carefully arranged into an expression of professional neutrality. Samuel had been with the Carter household for 11 years. He had seen things. He had kept quiet about most of them. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Samuel said. Nathaniel stared at him. "Why was the door locked?" "Mrs. Carter had the locks changed yesterday afternoon, sir." A beat of silence fell between them. "I beg your pardon." "The locks were changed," Samuel repeated in exactly the same tone of voice. "All of them. Front door, back door, the study, and the cellar. A man came from Charlottesville." Nathaniel looked at him for a long moment. Then he almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that didn't reach anything above the lips, more a reflexive tightening of the face than any real expression of amusement. "Is my wife awake?" he said. "Mrs. Carter rose at 5, sir. She's taken breakfast in the garden." "Then I'll go to the garden." "Of course, sir." Samuel stepped aside and Nathaniel walked into his own house, which smelled different. He noticed it immediately and couldn't name it. Not an unpleasant smell, just different. Like something had been aired out, like windows had been open that were usually kept shut. He walked through the front hall, past the parlor, and stopped. The portrait was gone. Above the parlor fireplace, there had always hung a large oil painting of Nathaniel that his father had commissioned when Nathaniel turned 25. It was an imposing thing, Nathaniel standing at the edge of the north field, one hand resting on a fence post, the other at his side. It had been the first thing visitors saw when they entered the house. It had been the first thing Nathaniel saw when he walked through that door. The wall was bare. A clean rectangle of lighter paint marked where the frame had hung. Nathaniel stood in the doorway of the parlor and looked at that bare space for a moment. Then he turned and went through the house to the back and out to the garden. Elizabeth was seated at the wrought iron table beneath the old oak at the far end of the garden. She had a cup of tea. She had a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. She was looking at the rose beds along the south wall, her expression composed and distant, as though she were studying something that interested her but didn't particularly move her. She wore a plain cotton dress the color of a summer sky, her brown hair pinned at the nape of her neck in her simple, characteristic way. No ornamentation, no performance of any kind. She did not look up when he crossed the garden toward her. "Elizabeth," he said. "Good morning, Nathaniel." Her voice was even. She turned a page of her book. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He waited for her to look at him. She didn't. "The locks," he said. "Yes, you had the locks changed on my house." She looked up then. Her eyes were very calm. Blue-gray, like still water. He had always said they were her most striking feature. He hadn't said it in several years. "I had the locks changed on our house," she said. "And I had a new key made for you. It's on the table in the front hall. You might have told me." "You weren't here to tell." The words landed without heat. That was the thing about Elizabeth. She never raised her voice. In nearly 8 years of marriage, Nathaniel had never once heard his wife shout. He used to consider this evidence of her good breeding. Lately, when he thought about it at all, it struck him as something else entirely. Something he couldn't quite name. "I was in Charlottesville," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know." Something in the way she said it made him pause. Business ran later than expected. She turned another page of her book. "Nathaniel, you don't have to explain yourself to me. You never have before." He reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the edge of her book, closing it gently. She let him. She set her hands in her lap and looked at him, waiting. "What is this?" he said. "What is what?" "The locks, the portrait. You're sitting out here at 6 in the morning reading." He shook his head. "What are you doing?" Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I'm drinking my tea," she said. "Would you like some?" "I don't want tea." "Then perhaps you'd like to tell me what you do want." He studied her face. There was nothing hostile in it. No coldness, no bitterness, no visible wound. She looked, if anything, rested. More rested than he'd seen her in some time. And that was the thing that unsettled him most. Not the locked door, not the missing portrait, not even the quiet strangeness of her manner. It was the fact that she looked like a woman who had slept well. "I want to understand what's happening in my own home," he said. "That," Elizabeth said carefully, "is a very good place to start, sir." He didn't push the conversation further that morning. Nathaniel Carter was not a man who pushed conversations he didn't yet know how to control. He asked for coffee, got it read through a week's worth of correspondence that had accumulated in the study, and told himself that whatever this was, this quiet, orderly disruption his wife had arranged, it would resolve itself the way these things did. She was making a point. He would let her make it. And then things would go back to normal. He told himself that while he sat in the study. He told himself that while he ate his noon meal alone, since Elizabeth had apparently gone to visit the Hadley family 3 miles down the road. He told himself that while he walked the North Fields in the afternoon with his foreman, a lanky Tennessee man named Ira Moss, reviewing the season's progress. "Looking good, sir," Ira said, squinting down the rows. "We'll turn a strong yield if this weather holds." "Good." Nathaniel paused at the edge of the field. "Ira, how long have you worked this land?" Ira looked at him sideways, surprised by the question. 6 years, Mr. Carter, since the spring of 1811. "In that time, have you ever had cause for complaint?" Ira was quiet for a moment. "No, sir. Wages, fair work is honest." "Good," Nathaniel said again. He looked out across the field. 6 years. He had hired this man, put him to work on this land, and he couldn't have said off the top of his head what Ira Moss's wife was named, or whether he had children, or where he'd come from before Tennessee. He didn't know why that thought visited him right then. He set it aside. When he came back to the house in the late afternoon, Clara was on the front porch. His daughter, 8 years old. She sat on the top step with her knees drawn up, braiding 3 long strands of sweetgrass into each other. She looked up when he came through the gate, and her expression did something complicated, pleasure and caution together, like she was glad to see him and wasn't certain yet whether she ought to be. "Papa," she said. "Clara." He stopped at the base of the steps. "What are you making?" "A braid for Mama's wrist." She held it up to show him. The sweetgrass was green and pale gold together. "She likes the way it smells." "Does she?" "She told me last summer. She said it smells like the field does right before it rains." Clara looked down at her work again. "Where were you?" "Charlottesville." "You were supposed to be back 3 days ago." The words were said without accusation. She was 8. She was simply reporting information the way a child reports a fact she's been holding for a while, waiting to have somewhere to put it. Nathaniel sat down on the step beside her. She moved over to make room for him, the way she always did. Automatic and comfortable, like his presence beside her, was still a natural thing. He was grateful for that. He was aware of being grateful for it, which was a feeling he didn't entirely know what to do with. "I had business that ran longer than I expected," he said. Clara nodded, looking at her braid. "Mama says that's all right. She says some things take longer than people plan for. That's wise of her." "She said that to Mrs. Hadley, not to me." Clara paused. "But I heard her say it, through the window." Nathaniel looked at the top of his daughter's head. Her hair was the same dark brown as his braided back loosely, the way Elizabeth always fixed it in the summer. She was growing fast. He had the sense, sudden and disorienting, that he had missed something, that there were inches and months of this child that had happened without him present, and he couldn't account for where exactly he had been instead. "Clara," he said, "does your mother seem well to you lately?" Clara thought about this seriously, the way she thought about most things. She turned her braid over in her hands. "She seems different," she finally said. "Different how?" "Quieter, but not sad quiet." She frowned, searching for the word. "Decided quiet. Like when I've already made up my mind about something, and there's no point talking about it anymore." Nathaniel looked at her. "When did you start sounding so grown?" Clara shrugged one shoulder. "Mama reads to me every night. She says words are how people learn to see things." She tied off the end of the sweetgrass braid and held it up to examine it in the late light. "Do you think she'll like it?" "She'll love it," he said. "How do you know?" It was a genuine question. There was nothing sharp in it, no challenge meant. She just wanted to know how he knew. He didn't have an answer. He sat beside his daughter on the steps of his house in the long summer evening and found that he did not have a ready answer to a simple question a child had asked him about his own wife. Elizabeth came home from the Hadleys around supper time. She came in through the back, spoke to the cook, appeared in the dining room just as the table was being set, and moved through all of it with the same unhurried, particular composure she'd had in the garden that morning. She asked Nathaniel about his walk through the north field. She listened to his answer. She asked Clara to sit up straight. She passed the bread. It was entirely, almost mockingly normal. After Clara had gone to bed, they sat in the parlor. The parlor with the bare wall above the fireplace, and the silence between them was the particular kind that has weight to it. Not hostile, not comfortable, just present. "Where is it?" Nathaniel said. Elizabeth looked up from her needlework. "The portrait?" "Yes." "In the attic. I had Samuel carry it up." "That portrait has hung in this parlor since before we were married." "I know it has," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "My father commissioned it." "Yes. He told me about that the first time we met, and the second time, and the third." She set down her needlework. "Nathaniel, that portrait is of a 25-year-old man standing in a field. I looked at it every day for 7 years. I've decided I'd rather look at something else." "What did you put in its place?" "Nothing yet. I thought I'd take my time and find something I actually wanted to see." He looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them raised their voice. The candle on the mantelpiece burned steadily. "I have the sense," Nathaniel said slowly, "that I have come home to find something fundamentally different in this house, and that no one is going to tell me directly what it is." Elizabeth tilted her head slightly. "What makes you think it's something that needs to be told to you directly?" "Because it's my house, and my family, and I'd like to understand what's changed." She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly measured, the way it always was. "Nathaniel, what day is Clara's birthday?" The question caught him off guard. "August, late August." "The date?" He paused. "The 26th, he said. He wasn't entirely certain. "The 23rd, Elizabeth said. "She'll be 9 this year. You've missed the last 2. She picked up her needlework again. "That's not an accusation, it's information. I think it might be useful to you." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Somewhere in the house a door settled on its frame. "You changed the locks," Nathaniel said. "I did." "Because I missed her birthday." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I changed the locks because it occurred to me that this house has been running well thoroughly efficiently without you present for a very long time, and I thought it was worth reflecting on what exactly that means. This house runs well because I provide for it." "Yes," she said. "You do?" She set down her needlework again. Something shifted in her expression, not anger, but something beneath anger, older than anger. "And I am grateful for the roof and the food and the fields and the firewood and all of it, Nathaniel, I genuinely am. But I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer me." She paused. "When is the last time you sat in this room because you wanted to be here, not because you had nowhere else to be? Not because you were too tired to go somewhere else. Because you actually wanted to be here with us." He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. "Think about it. Don't answer me right now. Just think about it." He closed his mouth. She picked up her needlework a third time. "I'm going to bed soon," she said quietly. "Clara will want you to tell her good night. She won't ask because she's been taught not to make demands, but she'll want it." He went upstairs. He stood outside Clara's door for a moment before he knocked softly. She was still awake. He could see the thin line of candlelight under the door. "Come in," she said. He opened the door. She was sitting up in bed with a book in her lap, the sweetgrass braid on the pillow beside her, already tied around her own wrist instead. She looked up at him with those dark Carter eyes, and that careful, slightly watchful expression that reminded him uncomfortably of how his wife used to look at him before she stopped bothering to be watchful. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said. "Mama lets me read until the candle burns to the mark." She showed him there was a small scratch on the candle at a certain height. "She says it's important to decide some things for yourself." Nathaniel pulled the chair from the corner and sat down beside the bed. "What are you reading?" She held up the cover. He couldn't read the title from that angle, but didn't ask her to turn it toward him. "Is it good?" "Very good. There's a woman in it who builds a library, all by herself, one book at a time." Clara traced the edge of the cover. "Mama says real things are built like that. One thing at a time." "Your mother says a lot of things. She talks to me when she's working in the garden. She says it helps her think." Clara paused. "She used to tell you things, but she stopped." Nathaniel looked at his daughter. "Did she tell you that—" "No." Clara shook her head. "I just noticed. I notice things." He stayed for nearly half an hour. He didn't talk much. Clara did most of the talking, telling him about the Hadley children, about a hawk she'd seen in the south pasture, about a letter she'd started writing to her cousin in Philadelphia. He listened. He watched her hands move when she talked, animated and certain, and he thought about how little he knew of this person he had helped put into the world. When the candle burned to the mark, she blew it out without being told. "Good night, Papa," she said. "Good night, Clara." He stood to go. She said his name again quietly just before he reached the door. "Papa, I'm glad you're home." The words were simple. She didn't mean them as anything other than what they were. But Nathaniel Carter stood in the doorway of his daughter's room and felt something give way slightly in his chest. Some small load-bearing thing that had held its position through a long day of discomfort and careful observation, and now at a child's uncomplicated good night quietly failed. He didn't show it. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "Sleep well." He closed the door behind him. He didn't sleep well himself. He lay in the bedroom Elizabeth had moved to the guest room he discovered quietly and completely, with all her things transferred without comment or ceremony. And he looked at the ceiling in the dark and thought about locked doors and bare walls, and a question he hadn't been able to answer. "When is the last time you sat in this room because you wanted to be here?" He tried to remember. He tried to find a specific night, a specific evening. A moment when he had come into this house and felt the particular easing of a man arriving somewhere that mattered to him. He could find moments of relief. Coming home out of bad weather, returning from a difficult trip to Richmond, but wanting the simple, clean thing of wanting to be where he was that was harder to locate. The night outside the window was full of summer insects, their noise constant and indifferent. Nathaniel Carter, owner of 460 acres of some of the finest land in Albemarle County, stared at the ceiling of the bedroom he no longer shared with his wife, and found himself unable to sleep in the house he had locked himself out of that morning. He lay there a long while, and somewhere in that dark, restless stretch of Virginia summer night, a thought arrived that he had not invited and could not dismiss. He had been a guest in this house for years. Not in the way visitors were guests, welcomed, expected, attended to. In the other way. The way a man is a guest in a place he passes through, using what he needs, leaving what he doesn't, and never quite committing to the full weight of being there. Elizabeth had changed the locks, and he was beginning to understand slowly and without comfort that they had needed changing for a very long time. He didn't know yet what to do with that. But for the first time in a great many years, Nathaniel Carter was lying awake inside his own house, thinking about the people who lived in it. It was all things considered a beginning. He found her in the kitchen before 7 the next morning. Not in the garden this time. Not in the parlor. In the kitchen, standing at the long wooden table with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, going through a leather-bound household ledger with the kind of focused attention most men reserved for business contracts. The cook, a stout woman named Della, moved around her without comment, the way people move around something that has always been there. Elizabeth didn't look up when Nathaniel came in. She turned a page. "You're up early," he said. "I'm always up early." She ran her finger down a column of figures. "Della, the sugar account is short again. Can you check the cellar stock before noon?" "Yes, ma'am," Della said, and disappeared through the back without so much as glancing at Nathaniel. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the hearth and stood with it, watching his wife work through the ledger with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing this a long time and expected to go on doing it without interruption. He had never once in nearly 8 years of marriage sat down with Elizabeth to discuss household accounts. The house ran. He assumed she managed it. The specifics had never interested him. "How long have you been keeping those?" he asked. "Since the first month we were married." She didn't look up. "Your mother showed me how. She said a woman who doesn't know where her household stands financially is a woman who can be deceived." A brief pause. She was right about that. The word deceived sat between them for a moment. Nathaniel took a drink of his coffee. "Elizabeth, the north fence along the Hadley border needs repair," she said, still looking at the ledger. "I've been asking Ira Moss about it since April. He says he's mentioned it to you twice. If it fails before harvest, we'll lose 3 days of labor moving cattle. I'd like that handled this week." He stared at her. "You're talking to me about the north fence." "I'm talking to you about your land, yes." She finally looked up, and her expression was entirely practical. "Your home. These are the things that need attention. Would you prefer I not tell you?" "I would prefer," he said carefully, "to finish a conversation we didn't finish last night." "We didn't start a conversation last night. You asked me a question about the portrait. I answered it. She closed the ledger. If you'd like to start a conversation, Nathaniel, I'm here. He set his coffee cup down. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected deflection, the kind of polite redirection she'd always been so graceful at moving a conversation. The way a good driver moves a horse so smoothly, the passenger doesn't notice they've changed direction. This was something else. This was her sitting across a table from him and saying, "Here I am," with a calmness that had teeth in it. "Last night you asked me a question," he said. "When is the last time I wanted to be here?" I remember the question. I don't have a good answer for it. Something moved across Elizabeth's face. Not surprise, not satisfaction, just a faint, careful recognition. "I know," she said. "I don't think that means what you're suggesting it means." "What am I suggesting?" "That I don't value this family, this house, that I've been absent in some way, that—" He stopped. He picked up his coffee again, not to drink it, just to have something in his hand. "I've worked this land for 15 years, Elizabeth. Everything here exists because I worked for it." "Yes," she said. "It does." She folded her hands on top of the closed ledger. "And I have kept it. Every day that you were not here, I kept this house managed, these accounts raised. That child handled the disputes with neighboring farms, organized the harvests, negotiated with suppliers, maintained relationships with every family in a 30-mile radius that matters to our standing in this county." She paused. "I'm not saying this to quarrel with you. I'm saying it because I think you don't know it. I think when you picture what happens here while you're away, you picture something much simpler than what actually happens." Nathaniel looked at her. "I've never suggested otherwise," he said. "You've never suggested anything at all," Elizabeth said quietly. "That's rather the point." He spent the morning on the land walking the perimeter with Ira Moss the way he should have done weeks earlier. The north fence was worse than he'd expected, 3 full sections leaning badly, one post rotted clean through at the base. He looked at it and felt something he didn't usually feel about a fence, which was embarrassed. This was a failure of attention, plain and simple, and it had been sitting here deteriorating since April while he was elsewhere. "Get the timber from the south barn," he told Ira. "I want this done by Thursday." "Yes, sir." Ira paused. "Mr. Carter, for what it's worth, your wife's been real good about keeping track of things like this. She came out here herself in May and counted the posts." Nathaniel looked at him. "Elizabeth came out to the north fence." "Yes, sir. Walked the whole line. Made notes." Ira looked like a man who wasn't sure whether he'd said too much. "Just thought you should know. She works hard to keep things right." Nathaniel looked at the rotted post. He thought about his wife's rolled-up sleeves at the kitchen table that morning. He thought about the leather ledger. He thought about 7 years of household accounts he had never once looked at. "I appreciate you telling me," he said. He meant it. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but he meant it. The real trouble began at supper. It wasn't the supper itself. The meal was fine, the food good, Clara entertaining them both with an account of a frog she'd found behind the woodpile. It was after, when Clara went to help Della in the kitchen with something, and Nathaniel and Elizabeth sat alone at the table with the remains of the meal between them, and a silence that had been waiting patiently all day finally settled in. "I need to ask you something," Nathaniel said. "All right. Are you planning to leave?" Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "Define what you mean by leave." "I mean—" He stopped. "I mean, are you ending this marriage?" She was quiet for a moment. The candles on the table burned between them, and outside the dining room window, the summer dark was full of the same insect noise that had kept him awake the night before. "I haven't decided," she said. The directness of it hit him like cold water. He had expected denial or reassurance, or one of the careful, gentle deflections she was so skilled at. He had not expected "I haven't decided" delivered in the same tone of voice she'd used to tell him about the north fence. "Elizabeth, you asked me a direct question. I gave you a direct answer." She looked at the candle between them. "I'm not going to lie to you about where I am. I think that would be unkind, and I've spent enough time being kinder to you than the situation warranted." "What does that mean?" "It means that for a very long time, I've told you everything was fine." She looked back at him. "When you missed Clara's birthday the first year, I told you it was all right. It wasn't all right, but I told you it was. When you spent Christmas in Richmond business, you said, I told you we managed beautifully. We did manage. But it wasn't beautiful. When you were gone for 3 weeks in the spring and didn't write not once, I told myself you were busy. You were busy." She paused. "I've been an excellent wife, Nathaniel, at the particular task of making your absences comfortable for you." He was very still. "I always came back." "Yes," she said, "you always came back." Something in her expression shifted, not hardening exactly, but settling the way a judgment settles when it's finally being spoken aloud after a long time living only as a thought. "But there's a difference between a man who comes home and a man who is home. I've been married to the first kind. I'd like to know, I genuinely want to know, and I'm asking you honestly whether the second kind is something you're capable of being. Because if it isn't, then I need to start thinking clearly about what my life is going to look like." "You're talking about leaving your husband." "I'm talking about living honestly." She pushed back from the table slightly, not to leave, just to create space. "I'm 29 years old, Nathaniel. I have managed this house and this family with very little help for the better part of 8 years. I can keep doing that. The question is whether I do it as your wife or as something else." He stared at her. What would Clara think? He said it not as a weapon, but he heard how it landed. He watched Elizabeth's jaw tighten just barely, just for a moment, and then release. "Clara," Elizabeth said evenly, "would think exactly what I would tell her to think, which is that her mother made a careful decision after a long time of careful thought. She's 8 years old. She loves you. And you might consider that the best thing you could do for her isn't to ask her mother to stay, it's to give her a reason to." Clara came back in from the kitchen, then carrying a dish of preserves Della had sent, and the conversation stopped as completely and cleanly as a door closing. Clara sat down, looked between her parents, and with the instinct of a child who has learned to read a room, began talking about the frog again. Nathaniel listened to his daughter talk and thought about the phrase his wife had just used. Give her a reason to. So, he didn't sleep the second night either. He lay awake and he thought about Margaret Ashworth, not with guilt exactly, or perhaps with a particular kind of guilt that had been packaged very carefully for a long time, and he was now being forced to unpack in the dark. Margaret was a widow in Charlottesville, the daughter of a merchant family, handsome and clever, and uncomplicated in the way that women are uncomplicated when they require very little from you. He had been seeing her on and off for 2 years. Nothing declared between them, nothing permanent, just the particular comfort of a woman who was pleased to see him and made no demands he wasn't prepared to meet. He had never told himself it was anything other than what it was. He had also never told himself it was a problem. Lying in the dark bedroom of his own house, listening to the summer insects and the distant sound of his daughters even breathing through the wall, he found that the careful architecture of that self-justification had developed serious structural problems overnight. Elizabeth had not said the word. She had not accused. She had talked about absences and missed birthdays and letters not written, and she had never once said, "I know you were not in Charlottesville on business." But she had said, "I know where you were," with her eyes in that moment at the garden table yesterday morning when he'd offered his explanation, and she had allowed him to go on talking. She had always allowed him to go on talking. He sat up in the dark. He put his feet on the floor. He sat on the edge of the bed in the still summer heat, and he thought about a woman who had walked the north fence herself in May to count the rotting posts, who had kept 8 years of household ledgers, who had raised a child who said things like, "decided quiet," and who had looked him in the eyes across a dinner table and said, "I haven't decided which was." Nathaniel understood now the bravest and most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. He had a good life. He had always known that, in a broad, unexamined way, the kind of knowing that lives in the back of a man's mind and doesn't need to be brought forward because it costs nothing to keep it where it is. He had 460 acres. He had a house with 8 rooms. He had a name. He had Clara, who loved him, without condition, in the way children love parents, before parents give them cause to reconsider. And he had Elizabeth, who had stopped pretending, and who was now waiting patiently without drama, the way she did everything to see what he was going to do about it. The question was, what he was actually capable of doing. He didn't have the answer. But for the first time in a long while, he was sitting still long enough to realize he needed to find one. The next morning he got up at 5. He didn't know why precisely. He didn't usually get up at 5. His body woke him, and instead of rolling over, he got up. He dressed and went downstairs, and he was standing in the kitchen when Della came in at 1:30 and nearly dropped the basket she was carrying. "Lord above, Mr. Carter," she said. "You near stopped my heart." "Sorry, Della." He moved out of her way. "I'll get out of your way. You can stay if you've a mind to." She set the basket down and began moving through the kitchen in her efficient, unflappable manner. "Coffee'll be done shortly." He sat at the kitchen table, which he had never done in his life, and watched her work, and after a while he said, "Della, how long have you been with this household?" She glanced at him sideways. 7 years, Mr. Carter. Came the summer before Miss Clara was born." "Is it a good place to work?" She paused at the hearth. She turned to look at him with an expression that was considering whether to answer, and what version of the answer was wise. "Yes, sir," she said finally. "This is a good house. Mrs. Carter treats people right. She always has." "And when I'm away, is it different?" Della was quiet for a moment, attending to the coffee. Then she said carefully, "Mrs. Carter runs a steady house, sir. Whether you're here or not, she keeps things right. Same rules, same kindness, same standards." Another pause. "But Miss Clara asks for you at supper sometimes, when it's been a good while." He absorbed that. What does Mrs. Carter say when she asks? "She says you're busy, that you work hard for this family, that you'll be home when you can." Della set a cup of coffee in front of him. "She always says it like she means it." The words landed somewhere that didn't have a name yet. He drank his coffee. Elizabeth came down at 6:05 and stopped short in the doorway when she saw him at the kitchen table. She recovered quickly. She always recovered quickly, but there was a brief, unguarded moment before the composure settled back into place, and in that moment, he saw something that looked almost like surprise. And under the surprise, something that might, if he were reading it right, have been the faintest edge of relief. "You're up early," she said. "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday it was true. It's still true." She went to the coffee, poured a cup, sat down across from him at the kitchen table. Not the garden, not the parlor. The kitchen table, which was practical and undecorated and had no associations except work. "Did you sleep?" "Not well." "Nor did I." She looked at him over her cup. "Nathaniel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, I'm not going to use it against you. I just want to know it." He waited. "Do you love me?" The question was direct, low, completely without tremor. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the early morning, and asked him the thing that he realized should never have to be a question after 8 years of marriage, and the fact that it was a question was a verdict in itself. He thought about Margaret Ashworth. He thought about the portrait in the attic. He thought about Clara on the steps braiding sweetgrass. He thought about a leather ledger and a rotted fence post and a door that had needed new locks. "I think I have been," he said slowly. "And I think I stopped showing it. And I'm not sure when that happened, or whether it was something that happened all at once, or so slowly I didn't notice it going." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in satisfaction, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who had suspected an answer and was now certain of it. "That's honest," she said. "It's the best I can do right now. That's all I asked for." Done. 3 hours later, he was in the yard, splitting firewood. Not because the wood needed splitting, Ira's men handled the wood. He was out there because he needed something to do with his hands and his body, while his mind was doing things he didn't know how to manage at a desk. He'd taken off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, and he was working through a pile of oak logs with a methodical intensity that Ira Moss watched for a full 5 minutes before he walked over. "Mr. Carter," Ira said carefully. "Moss. Those logs aren't going anywhere, sir." "I know that." Ira watched another log split cleanly. "Is there something you'd rather I have the men doing?" Nathaniel stopped. He set the axe down and looked at Ira, and then he said something that he could tell surprised the man considerably. "Sit with me a minute." They sat on the woodpile. It was hot. The summer heat was sitting heavy on everything by mid-morning, thick and unmoving. Nathaniel looked at the main house and said, "Ira, if you had been neglecting something important, something that was your responsibility, something you should have been attending to and weren't, what would you do?" Ira considered this with the gravity it deserved. "I reckon," he said finally, "I'd start attending to it, and I wouldn't make a big show of it. I'd just start doing it and do it well, and let that speak for itself. What if the damage was already done? Well?" Ira turned his hat in his hands. "If the fence is already rotted, you can't unrot it. You can only build new fence, better fence than what was there." He paused. "Depends on whether what you're trying to fix is worth the building, I reckon." Nathaniel looked at him. "You knew what I was asking about." Ira met his eyes steady and honest. "Wasn't hard to figure, sir." Nathaniel stood and picked up his coat. "Get the men on that north fence today. I don't want to wait until Thursday." "Yes, sir." "And Ira." He stopped. "Thank you." He walked back toward the house, and as he came through the gate, he saw Elizabeth at the upstairs window of the guest room. She was looking down at him. She wasn't trying to hide it. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. She stood there a moment, and then she turned back to whatever she'd been doing. He stood in the yard, looking at the empty window for a moment before he went inside. That afternoon, the Hadley boy James, 17 and perpetually underfoot, came riding up the lane with a letter which he delivered to Elizabeth on the front porch with great ceremony, and then lingered hopefully. Elizabeth thanked him, sent him on his way, and brought the letter inside. Nathaniel was in the study when she knocked on the open door. "This came for you," she said. "The boy said it came from Charlottesville." She held out the letter. He looked at it. He knew the handwriting on the front without having to think about it. Margaret's hand, rounded and distinctive, the letters slightly crowded together. He looked at Elizabeth's face. She was looking at the letter, not at him, and her expression told him everything he needed to know about how much she already understood and had already decided not to say. He took the letter. He did not open it. He set it on the corner of the desk and said, "Elizabeth." She looked up. "I have to tell you something." She waited. "And I want to tell you that I know it doesn't, that nothing I say will—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to sentences that ran away from him. He tried again. "There is something I've been doing that I should not have been doing, and I know that saying I'm sorry is not equal to the thing, but I am sorry. And I want you to know that I know the difference between those two things." Elizabeth stood in the doorway of his study and looked at him for a long, measured moment. Her face did the same complicated thing it had done at the kitchen table, moving through something private and arriving somewhere he couldn't entirely read. "How long?" she said. 2 years. Not a flicker. Not even a breath that changed. "Is it over?" "Yes." "Did you decide that before or after you came home to a locked door?" The question was quiet and precise, and it went in like a needle. He held her gaze. "I decided it last night," he said, "lying awake in that room, when I understood what I'd been doing to this house, to you." Silence. "That's the truth," he said. "I'm not asking you to—" "I know you're not asking me anything," she said. "That's not what this is." She looked at the letter on the corner of his desk. "Burn it," she said simply. "Whatever it says, burn it. I don't want it in this house." He picked up the letter. He walked to the small fireplace in the corner of the study, knelt, and held it to the existing coals until it caught. He watched it burn. He didn't read it. When he stood and turned back, Elizabeth was still in the doorway. "I'm not forgiving you today," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What you're sorry for is real, and it happened, and I have to decide what to do with it. But," she paused, "but I'm also not leaving today, and I think you should know that." He nodded. "I'm going to need time," she said. "And I'm going to need you to understand that the work ahead is not about convincing me of anything. It's about becoming something different. Not for me, not for Clara." She looked at him steadily. "For yourself. Because if you do it for us, it won't hold. Men who change for other people find reasons to stop changing when the other people stop watching." He stood by the fireplace with the faint smell of burning paper in the room between them and said, "How do you know that?" "Because I've been watching you for 8 years, Elizabeth said, "and you are a man who does exactly what is required of him and not one thing more. I would like to meet the man who does more than what's required because he's decided he wants to." She turned and left. He stood in the study for a long time. Outside, through the window, he could hear the sound of his men on the north fence hammers against posts, the creak of new timber going in. He had not needed to tell them twice. He had asked for it, and they were doing it, and the sound of something broken being rebuilt was reaching him through the window in the heavy Virginia summer air. And he stood there and let it. The letter was ash. The portrait was in the attic. The guest room down the hall had his wife's shoes beside the door and her hairbrush on the dresser, and the small book of poetry she read when she couldn't sleep on the nightstand. Nathaniel Carter had everything. He had always had the land, the house, the name, and he was standing in the middle of it, feeling more genuinely poor than he had in all his life. But something else was also true. He had told her the truth. She had stayed, not forgiven, not repaired, just stayed. With conditions that were harder than any boundary he'd ever negotiated from a woman who had every reason to walk and had chosen for today, for this one careful and deliberate day, not to. That was not nothing. He went to find his daughter. Clara found him first. He was coming out of the study, still carrying the smell of ash on his hands, when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs with her book under her arm, and that particular expression she wore when she had been thinking about something long enough that it had become a question she needed to say out loud. "Papa," she said, "are you and Mama fighting?" "No," he said. "You're not talking like normal." "How do we normally talk?" Clara considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "You don't mostly," she said, "but it used to be a normal kind of quiet. Now it's a different kind." He crouched down to her level, which was something he didn't do often enough, and which he was becoming more aware of with every hour that passed in this house. "What kind is it now?" She thought about it. "The kind before a thunderstorm," she said. "When the air gets heavy and you know something's coming, but you don't know yet if it'll be bad or just loud." He looked at his daughter and felt the particular wordless ache of a man who has been absent long enough that his child has had to develop her own vocabulary for the atmosphere in her own home. "It's going to be all right," he said. Clara looked at him steadily. "How do you know?" He didn't have a better answer for her now than he'd had the night before, when she'd asked how he knew Elizabeth would love the sweetgrass braid. But this time, something made him try harder. "Because I'm going to make it all right," he said. "That's not the same as knowing, but it's something." She studied his face for a moment with those sharp, careful eyes. Then she nodded once, the way her mother nodded that same contained, watching acknowledgement, and went through to the kitchen. He stood in the hallway and thought, she is 8 years old, and she nods like a woman who has decided to reserve judgment. His daughter had learned that from watching Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had learned it from being married to him. That thought followed him up the stairs and stayed with him the rest of the afternoon. The next morning, James Hadley came back. Not with another letter this time, just himself, hat in hand on the front porch, asking for Elizabeth, and looking like a young man who had been sent on an errand he wasn't entirely comfortable with. Nathaniel answered the door. "Mr. Carter?" James straightened up fast. "Good morning, sir. I was Mrs. Carter asked my mother to pass along some preserves, and my mother asked me to return the dish." He held up a ceramic dish. Nathaniel took it. "Thank you, James." "Yes, sir." The boy didn't leave. He turned his hat in his hands. "Sir, I don't mean to speak out of turn." "Then perhaps don't," Nathaniel said, not unkindly. James Hadley looked at him with the particular courage of a 17-year-old who has decided something is important enough to risk embarrassment over. "My mother says Mrs. Carter is the finest woman in the county," he said in a rush. "She says there isn't a family for 30 miles that hasn't had cause to be grateful to her. And she wanted me to. She said if I saw you, I should tell you that." He stopped. "I'm sorry, sir. She told me to say it, and I reckoned I ought to." Nathaniel looked at the boy for a long moment. "Your mother is right," he said. James exhaled with visible relief, put his hat back on, and left at a near trot down the lane. Nathaniel stood on the front porch, holding the ceramic dish, and thinking about 30 miles of families with cause to be grateful to his wife, none of whose names he could have told you without effort, while he'd been in Charlottesville believing himself the most important person in his own story. Elizabeth appeared behind him. "Was that James returning your dish?" She took it from him. "Did he say something?" He looked flustered. "His mother sends her regards." Elizabeth smiled small private, the kind of smile that belongs to someone who is liked and knows it without making anything of it. "Margaret Hadley is a kind woman. She brought food to this house every week for a month when Clara had the fever last winter." He turned to look at her. "Clara was sick last winter." The smile faded. Not with accusation, Elizabeth was long past performing her wounds for him. It faded the way a light fades when someone blows it out, quietly, completely. "January," she said, "for 12 days. She's fine now, as you can see." She went back inside. He stood on the porch in the summer heat and did the arithmetic of January in his head, and found himself in Richmond at a dinner with men from the state legislature drinking good wine and discussing land legislation, and he had not known his daughter was 12 days sick. He had not known because no one had told him. He had not known because Elizabeth had managed it the way she managed everything efficiently and without complaint, and had not wanted to worry him, and he had not been the kind of man who could be counted on to come home if he was worried, so there had been no point in worrying him. His daughter had had a fever for 12 days in January, and he had not known. He went inside to find Clara. She was in the back garden with a stick drawing something in the dirt. Letters, he realized when he got closer. She was practicing writing, spelling out words from memory with the stick, the way another child might use slate and chalk. "Clara," he said, sitting on the garden bench nearby. She looked up. "Yes, Papa?" "Were you sick last winter?" Something moved across her face, a brief unguarded flicker of surprise, and then the same careful settling that he recognized now as a thing she had learned. "The fever," she said. "Yes, but I'm better now." "I know you're better. I'm sorry I didn't know about it when it happened." Clara drew another letter in the dirt. "Mama said not to tell you. She said you were busy." "I was," he said. "I was too busy. Do you understand the difference?" She looked up at him again. "Not really. Being busy is a fact. Being too busy is a choice." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "I made the wrong choice. For a long time. I'm trying to understand that." Clara watched him with those old, careful eyes. "Mama cried," she said very quietly. "When I was sick. At night, when she thought I was asleep, I could hear her in the next room." The words went in without warning and stayed there. "She didn't want me to hear," Clara said. "She always waited until she thought I was asleep." She drew another letter. "I didn't tell her I heard. I didn't want her to feel bad about crying." Nathaniel looked at his daughter, this 8-year-old child who had lain in a sickbed listening to her mother weep in the next room, and had chosen out of kindness to pretend she hadn't heard and understood that his wife had been carrying things in this house that had weight, real weight, and she had carried them alone and in the dark, and he had been in Richmond drinking wine. "Clara," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "You are a remarkably good person." She shrugged the way children shrug at truths that seem obvious to them. "Mama taught me," she said. "She says the kindest thing you can do for someone who's hurting is give them the space to hurt without making them feel bad about it." She's right. She usually is. Clara looked up at him with sudden directness. "Are you going to be home more now?" "Yes," he said. "I am." "Good," she said simply, and went back to her letters. He found Samuel Hayes in the cellar in the afternoon, taking inventory of the wine stock. Samuel moved through the narrow shelves with his lantern in a measured, deliberate way, making notes in his small leather book. And when Nathaniel came down, he acknowledged him with the same quiet, professional composure he had maintained for 11 years. "Samuel," Nathaniel said, "I want to ask you something." "Of course, sir, and I want you to answer me honestly. I'm not asking as your employer. I'm asking as a man who needs to understand something." Samuel lowered his lantern slightly and turned to face him. Something shifted in his expression, the professional surface thinning enough for the man beneath it to show through. He had the face of someone who had been waiting a long time for a particular question and had rehearsed privately how he would answer it. "Mrs. Carter," Nathaniel said, "over the past years, has she been—" He stopped. He was finding this harder to articulate than he expected. "Has she seemed well to you?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "She has seemed as well as a woman can seem when she is doing the work of two people and being thanked by neither," he said, and the precision of it was so unlike his usual careful neutrality that Nathaniel felt the sentence, the way you feel a plank give way under your foot. "Go on," Nathaniel said. Samuel looked at him steadily. "She learned the accounts the first year you were married because she realized you wouldn't. She learned to manage the laborers' schedules because Ira is good with the land, but not the people. She learned to negotiate with the suppliers because the man you hired to do it was adding to his own pocket. She found that out herself, sir, in the 3rd year. She resolved it herself. She didn't trouble you with it." He paused. "She hasn't troubled you with most things." Nathaniel stared at him. "She found out a man was stealing from me and handled it without telling me. She worried you would handle it badly," Samuel said simply. "She worried you would come home angry and make an enemy of a man whose family had connections to 3 other suppliers. She handled it quietly and found someone else, and the household accounts improved by 20% the following year." 20%? "Yes, sir." Nathaniel sat down on the cellar step. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at the cold stone floor and did not say anything for a long moment. "She's never told me any of this," he said finally. "No, sir." "Why?" Samuel looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite judgment, but contained elements of both. "Because, sir, and I say this with the greatest respect, you never asked." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Dense and particular, like the silence that comes after the last word of something that has needed to be said for a very long time. "She is the reason this house works," Samuel said with the careful firmness of a man saying what he has decided is more important than self-preservation. "Not the land or the money. Her. Her judgment. Her patience. Her refusal to let this place fall apart even when she had every reason to let it." He paused once more. "And she never complained. Not to me, not to anyone. She just kept going." Nathaniel stood up slowly. He felt the weight of what he'd just been told settling across his shoulders, not as burden exactly, but as something he now had to carry, and ought to because it was his, and he should have been carrying it all along. "Thank you, Samuel," he said, "for telling me." "Thank you for asking, sir," Samuel said, and went back to his inventory. He went looking for Elizabeth. He found her in the East Wing passage, where she was sorting through a crate of household linens, with Della's help setting aside what could be mended. What was beyond mending? What needed to be replaced before autumn? It was the kind of domestic work that runs a house invisibly, that no one thinks about until it isn't done, and Elizabeth was moving through it with her sleeves rolled up and her hair loosening from its pin in the summer heat. She looked up when he came in. Della discreetly took a pile of linens and went. "The supplier in the 3rd year," Nathaniel said, "the one who was taking from the accounts." Elizabeth went still. It was a small stillness, the kind a person who has learned not to react learns to make invisible. But he saw it. "Samuel told you," she said. "He did." "I told him not to." She set down the linen she was holding. "He told me anyway. I think he felt it was time." Nathaniel looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I told you why." "No, you told Samuel why. Tell me." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and leaned against the side table with her arms folded, and she said in a voice that was level but not entirely without feeling, "Because I had learned by the 3rd year what happened when I brought problems to you. You got angry, you got loud, you solved things with force when they could be solved with patience, and in doing so, you created new problems." She paused. "I loved you enough to work around it. I thought that was the right thing to do. I thought if I kept things running, kept things steady, kept you from having to manage the things you weren't suited to manage, it would be better. For the house, for Clara, for us." "And now," he said. "Now I think I was wrong," she said. "Not about you, about me. I thought protecting you from consequence was kindness. I understand now that it was just erasure. Every time I managed something you should have managed, I erased a little of you, and a little of myself." Her voice was still level, but it had a quality now of something said directly from the center of a person without shield or softening. "I made myself invisible. I kept doing it because I was good at it and it worked. But there's a cost to being invisible, Nathaniel, and I've been paying it a long time." He crossed the room. He didn't reach for her. He stopped a foot away and looked at her directly. "Tell me the cost," he said. She met his eyes. "I stopped expecting things," she said. "That's the cost. I stopped hoping you'd be different. I stopped looking for you in a crowded room. I stopped waiting at the window." She stopped. Then, "You want to know what changed? What made me change the locks? Take down the portrait, move into the guest room. It wasn't anything you did. It was me. It was the morning I woke up and realized I hadn't missed you in months. That I had been happier, quieter, more myself on the days you weren't here." She looked at him steadily. "And I thought if that's the truth, then I owe it to both of us to say so." Nathaniel stood in the East Wing passage and felt the particular quality of being told a truth so exact it couldn't be argued with. "Is that still true?" he said. "Right now." She considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. "Less than it was 4 days ago," she said. "But I'm not going to tell you that as a reward. You don't get credit for asking questions you should have asked years ago. I know that. I'm just being accurate. I know that too." She unfolded her arms. She picked up the linen she'd set down and looked at it, a way of doing something with her hands that wasn't about the linen. "Nathaniel, what do you actually want? Not what you think you should want. Not what looks right. What do you actually want from your own life?" The question hung between them in the warm, close air of the passage. He said, "I want to know my daughter. I want to know what she's afraid of and what she loves, and I want to be the kind of father she doesn't have to be carefully quiet around." He paused. "And I want to know my wife. The real version. Not the one who manages everything without telling me. The one who cried in January and didn't want anyone to hear." Elizabeth's breath caught. Just slightly. Just for a moment. But he heard it. "She's harder to know," Elizabeth said very quietly. "I reckon she is," he said. "I'm willing to do the work if she's willing to let me try." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Not weighted, not wary. Provisional. Like a door that's been cracked open by someone who hasn't yet decided whether to step back or step through. "Don't make me promises right now," Elizabeth said finally. "Just don't disappear tomorrow. That's all I'm asking for today." "All right," he said. She nodded, picked up another piece of linen, and went back to work. He stayed and helped her sort. She didn't tell him he was folding wrong. She just refolded the ones he'd done without comment, with the small private precision of a woman who has learned to correct things quietly. And he watched her do it, and this time he let himself notice it. The competence of her, the thoroughness, the complete absence of performance. And he thought, I have been married to this woman for 8 years, and I am only now beginning to see her." The twist came the next morning, and it came from a direction Nathaniel had not anticipated. Reverend Caleb Moore arrived at Carter's Hollow just after 8, riding a spotted gray mare, and wearing the expression of a man who has been given an uncomfortable assignment and has decided the Christian thing is to complete it without flinching. He was 50 years old, steady-voiced with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be beyond surprise at most of it. Nathaniel received him in the front parlor, the room with the bare wall above the fireplace. "Nathaniel." The Reverend sat without ceremony. "I'll say directly what I've come to say. There's talk in town." "There generally is," Nathaniel said. "Specific talk. About you and a widow in Charlottesville." The Reverend looked at him with frank directness. "I'm not here to scold you. You're a grown man, and I imagine you know your own sins. I'm here because the talk has reached people who matter to your wife, and I thought you ought to hear that from someone who isn't inclined to enjoy telling you." Nathaniel was very still. "How wide?" "Wide enough. The Hadley family has heard it. The minister in Charlottesville heard it 2 months ago and saw fit to mention it to his cousin who attends my congregation." The Reverend folded his hands. "Your wife is well liked in this county, Nathaniel. People are concerned for her." "She knows," Nathaniel said. "I told her." Reverend Moore looked at him, real surprise crossing his face, which was something Nathaniel suspected didn't happen to him often. "You told her yourself, 2 days ago." A pause. "How did she receive it?" "Better than I deserved." Nathaniel looked at the bare wall above the fireplace. "She's still here." The Reverend was quiet for a moment. Then he said with something that sounded like reluctant respect, "She has always been a woman of remarkable character." "She has." Nathaniel looked at him. "Reverend, what's being said in town specifically? I need to know." Moore hesitated. "There are those saying she drove you to it, that she was cold, inattentive, too proud." Something hardened in Nathaniel's chest, swift and hot and clean. "That is not true," he said, "and I want it made clear to whoever is saying it that it is not true. Whatever I did because of my own failure, not hers." The Reverend nodded slowly. "Would you be willing to say that publicly? At Sunday services? If you're willing." Nathaniel thought about Elizabeth sorting linens. Elizabeth walking the north fence in May. Elizabeth sitting up with a sick child alone in January, keeping her crying to herself so Clara wouldn't hear. Elizabeth managing 8 years of a household that he had shown up to periodically like a guest who expected to be welcomed and never asked what it cost to welcome him. "Yes," he said. "I'm willing." Moore stood and shook his hand. "I'll see you Sunday then." He was almost to the door when Elizabeth appeared in the hallway, coming in from the garden, her hands still earthy from whatever she'd been tending. She saw Moore and stopped. "Reverend," she said with the automatic grace of a woman who has been receiving visitors well for years, "I didn't know you were calling. Just a brief visit, Mrs. Carter." He looked at her with an expression that was warm and something more. Something like the look of a man who is glad to see a person doing all right when he'd been worried they might not be. "You're looking well." "Thank you," she said. "Are you staying for coffee?" "Another time." He put on his hat. "Mrs. Carter, you have a good home here. I hope you know that." Elizabeth looked at him steadily. "I've worked hard to make it one," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is precisely evident." He left. Elizabeth stood in the hallway with her dirty hands and looked at Nathaniel. "What did he actually come to say?" she asked. "That there's talk in town." She took a slow breath. "About Charlottesville?" "Yes." "How bad?" "Wide enough." He looked at her. "I told him I would speak to it Sunday, at services, publicly." Elizabeth stared at him. For the first time in days, her composure cracked not into distress, but into something raw and disoriented, the expression of someone who has prepared themselves for an outcome and been handed a different one instead. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know. People will. I know what people will think, and I know what they're currently saying about you, and I'm not willing to let that stand." Elizabeth looked at him for a long, unsteady moment. "Nathaniel, you didn't drive me to anything," he said. "If that's being said, it needs to be unsaid. By me. In public." He held her gaze. "This is not negotiable." She looked away. She looked at her hands. She looked back at him, and there was something in her face that he recognized after a moment as the expression of a woman who has been defending herself alone for so long that an offer of defense from someone else is almost incomprehensible. "All right," she said very quietly. "All right," he said. She went to wash her hands. He stood in the hallway of his house and felt the full accumulated weight of the last 5 days pressing down on him, not as punishment, not as burden, but as reality. The real shape of things finally visible now that he had stopped moving fast enough to avoid seeing them. He had built walls. He had called them success. He had stood behind them and called himself a good provider and a respected man, and the whole time on the other side of those walls, his wife had been quietly and methodically and without complaint building the actual life that those walls were supposed to protect, and he had never once gone to look at what she was building. He had missed his daughter's fever. He had missed her birthday twice. He had stood on the wrong side of his own front door and called it a temporary inconvenience. The question Elizabeth had asked him in the kitchen, "Do you love me?" was not, he understood now, a question about feeling. It was a question about attention. About the active, daily, sometimes inconvenient work of turning toward the people who are yours and staying turned toward them, even when something else is easier. He had not done that work. He intended to start. Not because Elizabeth had asked him to, not because Clara needed him to, but because he had stood in this house for 5 days and looked, really looked at what was here, and what he saw was something worth protecting, worth deserving, and he was not yet certain he was equal to it. That uncertainty was new to him. Nathaniel Carter had not spent much of his life uncertain. He had spent it confident, decided, forward-moving, sure of his own worth. He was less sure now, and strangely in a way he couldn't quite explain, in a way that felt less like loss than like the particular sharp-aired clarity that follows a long fever that felt like the most honest thing he'd been in years. Sunday came the way Sundays do in Virginia. Summer slow and heavy, and full of the smell of cut grass and church bells carrying across flat land. Nathaniel dressed without being told. He came downstairs to find Elizabeth already ready, Clara beside her in her good dress with her hair properly braided, and the three of them walked out to the wagon together without ceremony, the way a family does when they have decided for today, at least, to be a family. Nobody said much on the ride to the church. Clara sat between them and watched the road with her usual alert quiet. Elizabeth held her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead. Nathaniel drove. The Carter family arriving at Sunday services together was not in itself remarkable. They had done it before in the early years with the particular ease of people who were still figuring out how to be together in public. But 5 years of intermittent appearances and empty pews had made the sight of all three of them together on time, Nathaniel in the driver's seat instead of absent entirely, a thing that several people in the churchyard noticed and chose not to comment on directly. Margaret Hadley noticed. She caught Elizabeth's eye as they came up the steps and gave her the small, steady nod of a woman who knows more than she says and supports what she knows. Elizabeth returned it. Nathaniel saw the exchange and understood it, and the understanding was one more small stone added to the accumulating weight in his chest. Reverend Moore preached on the parable of the prodigal son. Nathaniel was not sure whether that was coincidence or pastoral deliberateness, and decided it didn't matter. He sat in the Carter family pew and listened. Really listened, not the way he'd listened to sermons for the last decade, with the surface of his attention while the rest of him was elsewhere, and heard things he had not heard before in a story he had known since childhood. The father in the story does not interrogate the returning son. He does not make him prove himself. He sees him coming down the road and he runs. That was the detail that reached Nathaniel and stayed. He runs. A man of standing, a landowner who runs because the thing that was lost is coming home, and the running matters more than the dignity it costs. He was not that man yet. He knew that. but he was beginning to understand what that man looked like. After the service, when the congregation gathered in the yard in the summer heat, with the particular restless social energy of people who have been sitting still for an hour, Nathaniel stepped forward. He had told the Reverend he would speak publicly. He had meant it. He had not until this moment fully understood what it would feel like to mean it. He found the Hargrove family first, Thomas Hargrove, who sat on the county council and whose wife had been at every social gathering in the county for 30 years, and whose opinion traveled reliably in all directions from its origin point. "Thomas," Nathaniel said. "Dorothy." "Nathaniel." Thomas shook his hand with the slightly careful warmth of a man who has heard things and is not sure what posture to take. "I want to say something," Nathaniel said loud enough that the three other families immediately nearby could hear without straining. He had not planned the words. He found standing there in the churchyard in the July heat that planned words were not what this required. "I've heard that there's talk about my wife, that there are people saying she is the reason for difficulties in my household." He paused. "I want to be clear for anyone who's heard that it is false. Whatever I have done wrong in my marriage, I have done because of my own failure. Not Elizabeth's. She has been a better wife than I have been a husband, and a better person than I have been a man, and I want that stated plainly." Silence. The kind that happens in a churchyard when something unexpectedly real has been said in a setting usually reserved for careful social performance. Dorothy Hargrove looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth was standing a few feet to Nathaniel's left, and she was looking at the ground, and her jaw was tight, and she was not crying, but it was the concentrated effort of a woman who has decided she is not going to cry in the churchyard on a Sunday morning, and is holding to that decision with both hands. "Well," Thomas Hargrove said after a moment, with the slow dignity of a man recalibrating, "that's a thing that takes character to say, Nathaniel." "It takes less character than it should have," Nathaniel said. "It should have been evident a long time ago without needing to be said." Margaret Hadley, standing near enough to have heard all of it, put her hand briefly on Elizabeth's arm. Elizabeth looked up at her, and the look that passed between them was the compressed, wordless communication of women who understand each other's private wars. Clara, standing to Nathaniel's right, slipped her hand into his without looking up at him, the way she slipped over on the porch step. Automatic, natural, like his presence beside her was simply a fact she was glad of. He held on. They rode home in the same quiet they'd ridden out in, but it was a different quiet. Clara fell asleep against Elizabeth's shoulder before they'd gone 2 miles, which was something she hadn't done on a wagon ride in years, and Elizabeth let her one arm around the child's sleeping weight, her head resting lightly on top of Clara's. Nathaniel drove, and didn't look at them directly, but was aware of them continuously, the way a man is aware of warmth near him in a cold room. After a while, Elizabeth said quietly, "You didn't have to do that. I know. People will think, I don't particularly care what people think right now," he said. "I care what's true, and what's true needed to be said." Silence. Clara breathed evenly against her mother's shoulder. "It was brave," Elizabeth said. "I'm not saying it fixed anything, but it was brave." "It was overdue," he said. "Brave would have been doing right by you to begin with." She didn't answer that, but she looked at him, a long, direct look that he felt on the side of his face, and he had the sense of something small and tentative shifting between them, the way a scale shifts when one side has been lightened by even a fraction. He did not reach for more than that. He drove his family home. The next 3 weeks were the hardest work Nathaniel Carter had done in years, and they were also the quietest. He was on the land every morning by 5. Not to perform industry, he had performed industry his whole life, making sure the right people saw him doing the right things. This was different. This was the kind of work that no one is watching and that matters anyway, the kind that a man does because the thing needs doing, and he is the one who is there. He worked alongside Ira's men on the fence line. He learned the names of the 3 men he'd been paying for 6 years without knowing them. Thomas, who had a wife expecting in September. Bo, who was 22 and had come up from Georgia looking for stable work. Old Ned, who had been working this land longer than Ira had. and knew the soil the way some men know Scripture personally and in detail. Nathaniel talked to them, not as an employer performing approachability, but as a man who had realized he'd been standing in the middle of his own life without seeing the people in it. Ned told him one afternoon, while they were replacing a gatepost, that the eastern field drained wrong and had been losing yield on the left quarter for 3 years. "Mrs. Carter asked me about it last spring," Ned said matter-of-factly. "She said she'd mention it to you." "She may have," Nathaniel said. "I wasn't paying the right kind of attention." Ned looked at him sideways, not with judgment, just with the frank, considering look of an older man assessing a younger one. "You're paying it now," he said. That was all. He went back to the post. Nathaniel had the eastern field regraded before the month was out. In the evenings he was home. He was home for supper, which was the first thing. He was home for the hour after supper, when Clara did her reading, and Elizabeth worked on correspondence, or mending the quiet domestic hour that had always existed in this house, and that he had spent for most of his marriage elsewhere. He sat in the parlor with them. He didn't always talk. Sometimes he read. Sometimes he watched Clara trace words on her paper with her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Sometimes he and Elizabeth sat across from each other in the kind of silence that was slowly and almost imperceptibly becoming the good kind again, the original kind, before it had curdled into distance. He did not push. He had promised her he wouldn't make promises, and he had extended that to mean he wouldn't demand progress or look for signs or ask her what she was feeling. He just stayed. Every day he stayed, and he let that be the only argument he made. Clara noticed. Clara noticed everything. One evening, about 10 days in, she looked up from her book and said, "Papa, you've been home every night." "I have," he said. "How long are you staying?" "I live here," he said. "I'm staying." She looked at him for a moment with that particular evaluating gaze. Then she went back to her book, but she was smiling at the page, and he saw it, and it was the smallest and most consequential thing that had happened to him in weeks. Pshaw! The twist he hadn't seen coming arrived on a Tuesday in the form of a letter that was not from Margaret Ashworth. It came from Richard Whitmore, Elizabeth's brother, 11 years her senior. A man Nathaniel had met 4 times in his life, and liked none of those times. Richard Whitmore was a lawyer in Philadelphia, with opinions about everything, and the financial success to make those opinions travel. He wrote to Elizabeth, not to Nathaniel, and he wrote in a hand that Nathaniel recognized when Elizabeth came to find him in the study, with the letter open in her hand, and her face doing the complicated, controlled thing it did when she was managing something that mattered. "Richard is coming," she said. Nathaniel looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing, the household ledger, the one Samuel had shown him how to read properly 2 weeks earlier. "When?" "2 weeks. He says he's heard things and wants to his word assess the situation." A beat. "Assess the situation," Nathaniel repeated. "He's been looking for a reason to do this for years," Elizabeth said. She sat down in the chair across the desk. "He never thought you were. He didn't think you were right for me. He told me so before the wedding, and I told him I'd made my decision, and he respected it. Mostly." She folded the letter. "He's heard about Charlottesville." "Of course he has. He'll want to know if I'm all right." "Are you going to tell him you are?" Elizabeth looked at him, not with evasion, not with the shuttered composure of the early days, but with the frank, direct look she'd been giving him more often lately, the look that felt like she was still deciding what he was, but was at least willing to keep looking. "I'm going to tell him the truth," she said. "That things have been difficult, and that they're in process. I'm not going to lie to my brother to protect your reputation." "I'm not asking you to," Nathaniel said. She looked at him a moment longer, as if checking whether he meant it. "He'll be hard on you," she said. "He has the right to be." "He doesn't actually. It's not his marriage." She paused. "But he loves me, and he'll be hard on you because of that, and I'm telling you so. You're not caught off guard." Nathaniel looked at her across the desk. his wife sitting in his study, warning him about her brother's arrival with the practical, almost impersonal consideration of someone who has started very quietly and without announcement to be on his side again. Not fully, not unreservedly, but a degree, a fraction, a direction. "Elizabeth," he said. Thank you." She looked up. "For telling me," he said. "For this. All of this. The way I know I haven't earned easy treatment from you, and you've been fair. Fairer than I had any claim to. And I don't say that to make you feel you have to respond to it. I just want you to know I see it." Elizabeth held his gaze for a moment. Then she stood up and said, "I'll tell Della we'll need the guest room properly aired. Richard keeps very particular standards about linens." She left, but at the door she stopped with her back to him and said without turning around, "You're different, Nathaniel. I don't know yet what it means, but I see it." Then she was gone. He sat in the study with the household ledger open in front of him and let the words settle careful and enormous into the space they had been growing toward for weeks. Richard Whitmore arrived on a Wednesday 14 days later on a horse that cost more than most men's yearly wages and wearing the expression of a man who has spent 2 weeks on the road rehearsing a conversation. He was tall, sharp-featured, with Elizabeth's gray-blue eyes set in a harder face. He shook Nathaniel's hand with the professional courtesy of a man who is pretending he doesn't want to do something else with that hand, and then he embraced his sister for a long moment, and Nathaniel saw over Richard's shoulder Elizabeth close her eyes. She had not told Nathaniel what she'd written back to Richard. He had not asked. They had supper, the four of them. Clara, who had been told her uncle was visiting and had greeted him with polite wariness, ate quickly and was excused. She kissed her mother good night, looked at her uncle with the assessing gaze she reserved for people she hadn't decided about, and said good night to Nathaniel last, which she always did now with the particular warmth of something recently reclaimed. After Clara went up, the three adults sat in the parlor. The parlor with the still bare wall above the fireplace, and Richard Whitmore looked at Nathaniel with the direct professional gaze of a man who has decided to say what he came to say. "I'm not here to make trouble," Richard said. "I want to be clear about that." "I appreciate it," Nathaniel said. "I'm here because my sister wrote me 3 months ago and told me she was reconsidering her life. She didn't ask me to come. She asked me not to. I came anyway because that's my right, as the only family she has in this country, and because I love her." He looked at Elizabeth. "I hope that's still all right." "It's all right, Richard," Elizabeth said with the tired patience of a woman who has been managing her brother's instincts to protect her for her entire adult life. "Good." He turned back to Nathaniel. "I know what happened. I know about the woman in Charlottesville. I know about the absences, the missed occasions, the things Elizabeth has carried in this house without assistance." He leaned forward slightly. "What I don't know, and what I came to determine, is whether any of what she's apparently witnessed in the last month is real, or whether you're a man who has learned to perform improvement." The room was very still. Nathaniel said, "That's a fair question." "I know it is. And I can't prove the answer to you. Not tonight, not across a parlor." He looked at Richard steadily. "The only proof is time. I know that. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to believe your sister's judgment, because she has better judgment than either of us." Richard looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating the way a lawyer's face shifts when an answer is unexpected and more intelligent than anticipated. "Elizabeth," Richard said without breaking eye contact with Nathaniel, "what do you want me to do?" Elizabeth looked at her brother, and then at her husband, and then at her hands. "I want you," she said carefully, "to stay 2 weeks and see what you actually see. Not what you expect to see, what's actually here." Richard nodded. "All right," he said. 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were not comfortable. Richard Whitmore was not a cruel man, but he was a precise one. He watched things. He asked Clara questions and listened to her answers with the careful attention of a man cataloging evidence. He walked the land with Ira Moss and asked questions about management and schedules. and what had changed in recent months. He sat in the evenings in the parlor and observed the way Nathaniel and Elizabeth moved around each other, the distances and the moments of closer, the things said and not said with the dispassionate focus of someone reading a contract for hidden clauses. Nathaniel bore it. He bore it because Richard had the right to it, and because enduring scrutiny without defensiveness was a kind of evidence in itself, and because Elizabeth had asked for 2 weeks, and he was going to give her brother those 2 weeks, if it was the last thing he did. The moment that changed things came on day 9. Clara had been asking for several days to go to the river, a wide, slow stretch of the Rivanna that ran along the eastern edge of Carterland, where she'd been swimming with Della's granddaughters since she was small. Nathaniel had been putting it off with the half-conscious habit of a man not yet fully reformed, and on day 9 he woke up and thought there is no reasonable reason to wait. He told Clara at breakfast that they were going to the river. Her face did something that hit him in the chest delight first, and then the careful second look of a child who has been told things before and has learned to check whether they're real. "Today," she said. "Today," he said. Richard Whitmore was at the table, and Nathaniel saw him clock the exchange, the delight, the careful second look, the checking. He saw Richard's jaw tighten, and he understood that what Richard had just seen was evidence of how many times Clara had learned to check whether what her father said was real. He spent the whole day at the river with his daughter. He didn't think about the ledger, or the fence, or the eastern field drainage. He sat on the bank and watched Clara swim with a freedom and physical confidence that told him she spent a lot of time here. She was comfortable in that water in the way children are comfortable in places that have become theirs. He waded in when she asked him to. He was not a man who spent much time wading in rivers, but he waded in, and she taught him where the current ran strongest and showed him the rock she'd named Thomas the Rock, because it was the biggest and looked like it was in charge of the others. On the way home, she fell asleep in the wagon with her head on his arm. He drove one-handed and let her sleep. Elizabeth was on the porch when they came in. She looked at Clara asleep against Nathaniel's side, and something moved across her face, something she didn't try to contain, something warm and unguarded. The first fully unguarded thing he'd seen from her in a long time. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. She helped carry Clara inside without waking her. At the foot of the stairs, she looked at him over their daughter's sleeping head, and the look was not cautious, and it was not managed, and it was not the look of a woman deciding what to give and what to withhold. It was just her, the real version. The one who had cried in January and hadn't wanted anyone to hear. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They carried Clara upstairs together. Richard found him in the study that evening. He came in without knocking, which was the kind of thing Richard Whitmore did, and sat down across the desk without being asked and looked at Nathaniel for a long moment. "She's still sleeping," he said. "Clara, completely out." "She swam for 4 hours," Nathaniel said. "She earned it." Richard was quiet. He looked at his hands. He looked back up. "When Elizabeth wrote me 3 months ago," he said, "she told me she had stopped missing you, that she had realized she was happier when you weren't here." He paused. She said it not as an accusation, as a fact she felt she had to be honest about. "She told me the same thing," Nathaniel said. "Does she still feel that way?" "You'd have to ask her." Richard's mouth tightened. "I'm asking you. What do you think?" Nathaniel considered it. He thought about the look at the foot of the stairs. He thought about 2 weeks of Richard watching everything with his lawyer's eyes looking for performance. "I think it's less true than it was," he said carefully. "I think she's looking at this differently than she was a month ago. Not because I've convinced her of anything, because she's seeing something different." He paused. "But she gets to decide what that means, not me." Richard looked at him for a long measuring moment. Then he leaned back and said, "I owe you something." Nathaniel waited. "When Elizabeth told me she was marrying you, I told her you were the wrong man for her." Richard said it without apology, just statement. "I told her you were a man who valued acquisition over people. who would give her a fine house and a fine name and disappear into his own importance. He stopped. I wasn't wrong about what you were, but I may have been wrong about what you're capable of becoming. Nathaniel looked at him. That's not a small thing for you to say. No, Richard said. It isn't. He stood up. My sister has good judgment. She always has. Better than mine most of the time, though I've never been able to bring myself to tell her that. He put his hand out. I leave Friday. I won't be coming back to check up. Whatever happens in this house is between the two of you. But I want you to know I'm watching from Philadelphia. And if she's unhappy, I will hear about it. Nathaniel stood and shook his hand. If she's unhappy, he said, I'll write you myself. Something that might generously have been called a smile crossed Richard Whitmore's face. He left. Nathaniel sat back down. He looked at the household ledger. He thought about the river, and Thomas the Rock, and Clara asleep against his arm. He thought about Elizabeth's face at the foot of the stairs. He thought about what it meant to be a man who does more than what's required. Elizabeth's words from weeks ago still living precisely in his memory because he has decided he wants to. He had not become that man yet. He was not fool enough to think that 6 weeks of effort undid 8 years of absence or that genuine change announced itself. Real change was quiet. It was the fence posts in the north line, and the grain in Ned's field, and the names of the men who worked his land, and a morning at the river that became a memory his daughter would carry forward into the rest of her life. He closed the ledger. He went to find Elizabeth. She was in the garden, the night garden lit by the long summer dusk, sitting on the bench under the old oak. The way she'd been sitting the morning, he came home to a locked door. But she wasn't looking away from him this time. She was looking up, and when he came through the gate, she didn't return to her book or look at her tea. She just looked at him. Richard is leaving Friday, he said. I know. He told me. Did he tell you what he said to me? No, but I can imagine. She moved over on the bench. Not much, just slightly. He sat beside her. The summer evening was all around them, the heat finally lifting towards something bearable. The insect chorus filling the dark, coming in at the edges of the sky, the old oak overhead, with its long history of everything it had shaded. He could hear the horses in the far paddock quiet and settled. He could hear his house occupied and breathing around its corners. Nathaniel, Elizabeth said after a while. Yes. Clara told me about Thomas the Rock. He looked at her sideways. She was almost smiling. Not the private managed smile she'd been wearing for weeks, something more open than that, something that reached her eyes. She named a rock, he said. She names everything. She named the gray mare in the South Paddock Duchess, which Ira has been trying to undo for 2 months. The almost smile became a full one, brief and real. She told me you waded in. Up to my knees. She said you didn't complain about the cold. It wasn't that cold. Elizabeth laughed, quietly, barely a breath of it. But it was real, and it was the first time he'd heard it in longer than he could accurately remember, and it moved through him like water through dry ground. I'm not there yet, she said, when the laugh settled. I want you to know that. I'm not where I need to be to say what you want me to say. I know. I'm not asking you to stop, she said. I'm asking you to understand that my timeline isn't yours, and I need you to respect that even when it's hard. All right, he said, and I need you to not be somewhere else in your head when you're here. That's the part that did the most damage. Not the absences themselves, but the way you were absent even when you were present. I understand. She turned to look at him directly. Do you? He met her eyes. I'm learning to, he said. I'm not there yet either, but I'm learning. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the garden and the settling summer dark, and she did not move away from him on the bench, and the space between them was smaller than it had been, and not yet nothing, and they sat together in the evening of their own life, learning slowly and without any certainty of outcome what it might mean to begin again. Richard Whitmore left on Friday morning the way he had arrived, with ceremony and precision, and the air of a man who has completed a task and is satisfied with his assessment. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the gate, and this time it was a real handshake, the kind between men who have arrived at a mutual if unspoken understanding. He embraced Elizabeth for a long time, said something in her ear that Nathaniel couldn't hear, and Elizabeth nodded against his shoulder. He ruffled Clara's hair, which she tolerated with the dignity of someone who feels she is too old for it but loves the person doing it too much to object. Then he rode away down the lane, and the Carter family stood at the gate and watched him go. And the quiet that settled after the sound of his horse faded was the particular quiet of people returning to their own life after a long, attentive interruption. "What did he say to you?" Clara asked Elizabeth. "When he whispered." "He said I have good judgment," Elizabeth said. Clara considered this. "Well," she said seriously, "he's right." And she went inside. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at the empty lane. Something in her face was looser than it had been that morning. The private sustained effort of being observed and managed at the same time visibly released the way a person breathes differently when a room empties. "You all right," he said. "I'm glad he came," she said. "I'm glad he's gone." She turned and went inside. Nathaniel stood at the gate a moment longer and looked down the lane where his brother-in-law had disappeared, and thought about what Richard had said. "I may have been wrong about what you're capable of becoming." Not a declaration of faith, not a cleared ledger. Just the honest revision of a man who had looked at the evidence and updated his position. It was the most Nathaniel had any right to expect from anyone right now, and he was grateful for it. He went inside to start his day. August arrived, and with it, Clara's birthday, the 23rd, which he had written on a piece of paper and tucked into his coat pocket 2 weeks earlier, and checked every morning, like a man who has learned the cost of forgetting. He had been thinking about it for weeks. Not in the way he usually thought about occasions as obligations to be discharged efficiently, but in the particular way he'd been thinking about most things lately, which was slower and more deliberate and attentive to what the thing actually meant. Clara would be 9. She had spent 8 of those birthdays with a father who was there sometimes and not others, and never entirely present even when he was there. He could not undo those 8 years. But he could make this one matter, and he had decided quietly, and without telling anyone, how he was going to do it. The morning of the 23rd, he was up at 4. He went to the kitchen, and he made a complete mess of it, and Della came in at 5, and found him standing amid the evidence of his attempt with flour on his coat and an expression of determined humility. "Mr. Carter," Della said, looking at the kitchen. "I'm making Clara a birthday cake," he said. Della looked at the kitchen for another moment. Then she said, "Move over," and came to stand beside him. And for the next 2 hours, she taught him with patient and only occasionally suppressed amusement how to make a proper pound cake. He did the work himself. She corrected him when he needed correcting, and let him make mistakes he could fix, and didn't take over when it would have been easier for both of them. The result was imperfect. It was slightly lopsided, and one edge was darker than the other. Della declared it good enough, and he carried it to the cooling shelf himself. When Clara came downstairs at 7, she found her father in the kitchen with flour still in his hair, and she stopped in the doorway and stared. "Did you make that?" she said. "With Della's guidance," he said. "Yes." Clara looked at the cake. She looked at him. Then she walked directly to him and wrapped both arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest and stayed there, and he put his arms around her and stayed there too, and neither of them said anything because some things don't need words. And this was one of them. Over the top of his daughter's head he met Della's eyes. Della looked away and found something very important to attend to on the far side of the kitchen. He held his daughter on the morning of her 9th birthday in the kitchen that smelled of pound cake, and he felt the full clear weight of what he had nearly lost, not through malice, not through cruelty, but through the ordinary terrible negligence of a man who took for granted the things he thought would always be there. He would not do it again. Elizabeth was in the garden when he found her, which was where she often was in the morning, but the quality of her presence in the garden had shifted in the past weeks. She no longer looked like a woman arranging herself in a peaceful place to get through a difficult day. She looked like someone doing what she wanted to do. "She found the cake," he said. Elizabeth looked up. "I heard. There were sounds." She cried a little. "I know." Elizabeth had a small smile. "She came to find me before she came down. She was already going to cry before she saw it. She'd been hoping you'd remember." That landed with precision. "She was worried I wouldn't." "She was hoping you would," Elizabeth corrected gently. "There's a difference." He sat on the bench. Not across from her, beside her, which he'd been doing with increasing ease over the past weeks, the physical distance between them closing by degrees that neither of them announced or measured directly. "Elizabeth," he said. "I need to tell you something." She set down her work and looked at him. "I'm going to need you to tell me when I'm slipping," he said. "Not forever, not as a permanent arrangement, but for a while. I don't fully trust my own habits yet. They're old habits, and they're strong, and I've been fighting them, but I know what I'm capable of reverting to. I need you to tell me. Not protect me from the consequence the way you used to. Tell me directly." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. "That's a hard thing to ask me to do," she said. "I know. It puts something on me that feels like responsibility for your improvement." "Not responsibility," he said. "Just honesty. The kind you've always had and mostly kept to yourself for the sake of keeping peace." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to stop keeping peace at your own expense. If I miss something, tell me. If I'm not present, say so. If I'm becoming who I was, I need to know it from you before I've gone too far to hear it." She was quiet for a while. The garden was warm the late summer, starting to feel like something winding down rather than building up. "I can do that," she said finally. "But I need something from you in return." "Name it." "When I tell you, you don't defend, you don't explain, you just listen." She looked at him directly. "Because the old version of you explained everything, justified everything, made every absence sound like it was ultimately in service of this family, and maybe sometimes it was. But the explaining was a way of not hearing what I was actually saying." Nathaniel was very still. "I know. I need you to know it in the moment," she said. "Not later when you've had time to think about it. In the moment." "I'll try," he said. "I won't promise I'll always get it right. But I'll try." She nodded. It was the same nod she'd given him in the kitchen the first morning that contained watching acknowledgement. But it was warmer now. The watching in it was different. Less like surveillance, more like attention. She picked up her work again. He stayed on the bench. "The cake is lopsided," she said after a while. "Della told me. Clara will love it more for that. That's what I told myself when I was making it." Elizabeth glanced at him sideways, and this time the smile reached her eyes completely. "Good," she said. The birthday dinner was the best evening Carter's Hollow had seen in years, and possibly ever. Nathaniel had written 3 weeks earlier to the Hadley family, and the 2 other families whose children Clara had named as her particular friends, and invited them to supper on the 23rd. He had not told Elizabeth. He had told Samuel, who had told Della, who had organized the food with the focused efficiency of a woman who was delighted to have an occasion to organize for, and was not going to let the occasion suffer for lack of attention. When the wagons came up the lane at 4 in the afternoon, the Hadleys, the Stantons, the Reeve family with their 3 daughters who Clara adored, Elizabeth came out of the house and stopped on the porch and looked at him. "You planned this," she said. 3 weeks ago," he said. She looked at the wagons and the children already spilling out of them, and Clara running down the lane, making a sound that was too loud to be called a laugh and too joyful to be called anything else. And she said quietly, "You wrote letters." Samuel helped with the wording. "I'm better with ledgers." Elizabeth stood on the porch of her house and watched her daughter run toward her friends in the late afternoon of her 9th birthday. And she put her hand over her mouth for a moment, just for a moment. And then she lowered it and composed herself and went down the steps to welcome their guests. But he had seen it. He had seen the moment before the composure, and it was the most important thing he'd seen in a long time, and he kept it carefully. The evening was loud and full and warm. Children ran through the house and into the garden, and Nathaniel sat on the porch with Thomas Hadley and old Reverend Moore, who had come with the Hadley family. And he listened more than he talked, and at some point Clara appeared beside him and leaned against his arm, the way she leaned against everything she trusted without thinking about it, because it was simply there. Margaret Hadley found Elizabeth in the kitchen at some point during the evening, and Nathaniel passing through caught the end of what Margaret was saying. Hasn't looked like herself in a long time. I mean that as the best kind of compliment, Elizabeth. She looks like herself again tonight. He went back out to the porch before they saw him. He sat in the warm evening with Thomas Hadley and the Reverend, and the sound of his house full of people who liked each other, and he thought this is what this place was always supposed to be. Not a demonstration of what he'd built, not a monument to his acquisition, not a stage for his consequence. A house where people were glad to be. A house that had warmth in it. It had always had warmth. He simply hadn't been the source of it. He intended to be now. Or at least to contribute to it. To add to what Elizabeth had built, rather than simply use it and leave. The first real test came in September. A letter arrived from an associate in Richmond. A business matter, a land deal, the kind of thing that 3 months ago would have had Nathaniel on a horse within the hour. The deal was significant. The timeline was compressed. His presence in Richmond would be advantageous. He read the letter twice. He set it down. He picked it up and read it a third time. Then he went to find Elizabeth. She was in the study, his study, which she had started using in the afternoons for her own correspondence since he'd told her she was welcome to it, and she looked up when he came in. He handed her the letter. She read it. She handed it back. "It's a good deal," she said. "The Morrison tract has been undervalued for 2 years. If you move now..." "How long would you need to manage without me?" he said. She stopped. She looked at him. The question had landed differently than he'd intended, and he saw her recalibrate. Understand that he was not telling her, he was asking her, which was not a version of this exchange she had experienced before. "A week," she said slowly. "If you go, a week is manageable. And if I don't go..." She was very still. "The deal doesn't require you personally." "No, but my presence helps. Nathaniel." She set down her pen. "You don't need my permission to conduct business." "I'm not asking for permission," he said. "I'm asking what you actually need from me right now before I decide." The silence that followed was the kind that has meaning packed into it, the kind that represents something new being understood by someone who had not known to expect it. "Clara's reading recitation is on Thursday," Elizabeth said carefully. "She's been practicing for 2 weeks. She wants you to hear it." "I'll be back Wednesday," he said. "Then go," she said. She held his gaze. "And come back Wednesday." "I will." "Nathaniel." She paused. "Thank you for asking." He left for Richmond Monday morning. He was back Tuesday night, a day early, because the business resolved faster than expected, and because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. He didn't tell Elizabeth he was coming back early. He simply arrived unsaddled. His own horse came in through the back and found her in the parlor with Clara, who was practicing her recitation in a low, concentrated voice, moving her lips over the words she'd memorized, and moving her hands along with them the way she always did when something mattered to her. Neither of them heard him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment and watched his wife and his daughter in the lamplight. Elizabeth, with her needlework in her lap, nodding slightly as Clara ran the words, prompting once, when Clara hesitated, the two of them completely at ease with each other, in the way of people who have spent years building a private language. This was what had been here every night he hadn't been. He sat down in the armchair without saying anything. Clara looked up, registered him, blinked, and then broke into a smile so unguarded it was almost painful to look at. "You're early," she said. "Business finished fast," he said. "Keep going. I want to hear it." Clara straightened up. She took a breath. And she delivered her recitation from beginning to end, every word in place, her hands moving with the words, her voice gaining confidence with each line, and Nathaniel sat in his own parlor and listened to every word. When she finished, he said, "That was the best thing I've heard in months." Clara threw her arms around his neck. Elizabeth watched from across the room, and when he looked at her over Clara's shoulder, she was looking back at him with the expression he had been waiting for, without knowing. He was waiting for it. Not the managed composure, not the careful watching, not the private grief of a woman containing herself. Just her. Present, real, looking at him the way she used to look at him a long time ago, when they were new and the house was new and everything still felt like possibility. She looked away after a moment, but she was smiling. October brought the harvest, and with it the particular organized chaos that descended on every farm in the county for 6 weeks of sustained collective labor. Nathaniel worked the harvest the way he worked everything, now completely present, physically committed alongside his men, in a way he had not been in years. Old Ned watched him for 3 days without comment. On the 4th day, turning over a long row beside Nathaniel in the early morning, he said, "You're different." "So people keep telling me," Nathaniel said. "It ain't a complaint," Ned said. "Just an observation." He worked in silence for a moment. Land knows when a man's paying attention to it, responds different. People are the same more or less. Nathaniel looked at him. "You've been working this land a long time, Ned." "Long time," Ned agreed. "Have I been a fair employer?" Ned was quiet, considering. "You pay right and you keep your word on wages," he said. "That's fair in the legal sense. Whether it's fair in the full sense of the word is a bigger question." He paused. "It's getting fairer." Nathaniel went back to the row. "Good," he said. "I intend to keep improving on it." "I know you do," Ned said simply. "That's why I said it." The harvest came in strong. The eastern field regraded in August. Ned's advice finally acted on, yielded better than it had in 3 years. Nathaniel had the numbers from Ira, and he brought them to Elizabeth at the kitchen table one morning with the household ledger open, and showed her what the difference was. She looked at the numbers. She looked at him. "Ned told you about the drainage. 2 months ago, yes? He told me you'd asked him about it. Last spring," she said. "I was going to mention it to you, but I wasn't the kind of man who was easy to mention things to," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then back at the ledger. "The numbers are good," she said. "They are. And they would have been better sooner if I'd been paying attention." He turned the ledger toward her. "I want to show you what I'm thinking for next season. Tell me what I'm missing." She looked at him with a small, considering expression. Then she pulled the ledger toward her and started reading, and they sat at the kitchen table for the next hour, going over it together, him explaining, her questioning. Both of them occasionally disagreeing and working through it, the ledger passing back and forth between them. Like the thing, it was a shared document of a shared life. It was the first time they had sat down together over the business of this household and worked through it as partners, and it felt to Nathaniel like something fundamental shifting into a position it should always have been in. The second twist came in November, and it arrived in the form of a letter from Philadelphia. Not from Richard, from his wife, a woman named Anne Whitmore, whom Nathaniel had met twice and liked considerably. Anne wrote to Elizabeth, as she apparently did regularly, with the warm directness of a woman who has decided to be honest with her sister-in-law, regardless of what the sister-in-law's husband might prefer. Elizabeth read the letter at the breakfast table. Her face changed. "What is it?" Nathaniel said. She looked up slowly. "Richard has recommended you for membership in the Virginia Agricultural Society," she said. "He wrote to 3 men he knows on the board, without telling either of us." She looked at the letter again. "Anne says he decided after his visit in August that you were, her words, a man in the process of becoming worth knowing." Nathaniel sat very still. "Your brother," he said carefully, "the man who came here in August, ready to advise his sister to leave her marriage, recommended you for a society membership," Elizabeth said. She looked up, and she was doing the thing where she was working very hard not to let something show. But it was the wrong kind of working hard, the kind where the emotion is too big and too positive to fully contain, not the kind she'd spent the summer doing, where she was holding grief in place. "He didn't tell you he was going to do that," Nathaniel said. "He never tells me anything he does for me until it's done," she said. "He says it so I can't talk him out of it." Nathaniel looked at his wife across the breakfast table in the November morning in the house with 8 rooms, and the north fence rebuilt, and the east field regraded, and the portrait still in the attic where she had put it. And he thought about a leather ledger, and a locked door, and a bare wall, and the particular precise question a woman had asked him in a kitchen, "Do you love me?" He knew the answer now. Not the reflexive, unexamined answer he would have given a year ago. The real answer, the one that had weight and history, and the particular texture of something genuinely known. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked at him. "I want to hang something in the parlor," he said. "Above the fireplace. Not the portrait. Something else." She tilted her head slightly. "What did you have in mind?" "I don't know yet. I thought you might help me choose it." He paused. "It's your house, too. It always was. I'd like to start acting like it." Elizabeth put down Anne's letter. She looked at him for a long moment, the full direct look she'd been giving him more often now, the one without the careful distance built into it. "I saw a landscape painting at the Stantons last month," she said. "A view of the Blue Ridge in autumn. Margaret said the artist is local. We could write to him." "Write to him," Nathaniel said. She nodded. She picked up her tea. "I'll do it today." "Good," he said, and meant it the way he was trying to mean everything now, fully, without reservation, with his full attention directed at the moment he was in. The painting arrived in early December, and it was right. Nathaniel knew it the moment Samuel carried it into the parlor and held it up against the wall above the fireplace. It was the Blue Ridge in October, all burnt gold and deep red, and the particular blue-gray of mountain distance, and it had nothing to do with demonstrating anything about anyone. It was simply beautiful, and it had been chosen together, and it belonged to the room in a way the portrait never quite had. Clara stood in the parlor doorway and looked at it for a long time. "I like it better," she announced. "So do I," Elizabeth said. "Papa." Nathaniel looked at the painting. He thought about a 25-year-old man standing in a field with his hand on a fence post needing to be looked at. He thought about how much of his life he had spent needing to be looked at and how little time he had spent actually looking. "I like it much better," he said. Samuel hung it that afternoon, and when it was done, he stepped back and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been part of something he is glad to have been part of. He excused himself without ceremony and went back to his work, which was what Samuel Hayes always did, and Nathaniel watched him go and thought about what he owed this man and the others, not in wages which he had always paid, but in the attention and the acknowledgement that were their own kind of currency. He was keeping a different kind of account now. Christmas came to Carter's Hollow that year, the way it hadn't come in a long while, fully, loudly, with the house open, and the Hadleys and the Reeve family and Reverend Moore all present for Christmas dinner, and Clara in the best dress Elizabeth had made her, and Della in a state of magnificent controlled chaos in the kitchen, and Samuel moving through it all with the particular serenity of a man who has seen enough of the worst to properly appreciate the best. Nathaniel sat at the head of his table. Their table. He was careful to think of it now. The correction still fresh enough that he noticed it and looked at the people around it and thought about every Christmas he had not been here for. Richmond, Charlottesville, elsewhere. Nowhere that mattered as much as this. He did not flagellate himself for it. Elizabeth had told him in September that she needed him to stop apologizing and start doing, because a man who is constantly apologizing is still making the situation about himself, and he had heard her and tried to live by it. So he did not sit at Christmas dinner, drowning in retrospective guilt. He sat there and was present, and let the presence be the thing. After dinner, when the guests had gone and Clara had finally surrendered to sleep, and the house was quiet except for the fire in the parlor and the December wind outside the windows, Nathaniel and Elizabeth sat together in the parlor under the Blue Ridge painting with their tea. And it was the same room they had sat in on the first night he came home to a locked door, and it was a completely different room. The bare wall was filled. The silence was the good kind. The distance between them on the sofa was not the careful, managed distance of two people who have decided what they will and will not allow. It was the easy, natural closeness of people who have been moving toward each other for months and have arrived without ceremony somewhere that feels like home. Elizabeth was looking at the painting. "Are you happy?" Nathaniel said. She considered it honestly the way she considered everything. She didn't answer quickly. She sat with the question and turned it over and looked at it from the angles it deserved. "I'm more myself than I've been in years," she said finally. "Whether that's the same as happy, I think it might be something better than happy, something more durable." She looked at him. "Are you?" He thought about it. He thought about the ledger and the fence and the river and the cake and the harvest and the painting and the Christmas table full of people and his daughter asleep upstairs and his wife beside him in the firelight. "Yes," he said. Not with the automatic confidence of a man asserting something he hasn't examined. With the quiet, considered certainty of a man who has looked at his life and found it for the first time in a long time genuinely good. Elizabeth looked at him for a moment. Then she reached out and placed her hand over his. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration. Just her hand warm and certain, resting on his, the way something rests when it has decided where it belongs. He turned his hand over and held hers. "The locks," he said after a while. She looked up at him. "Do you still have a key to give me, or did you—" "I always had a key for you," she said quietly. "I told you that the first morning. It was on the table in the front hall." "I never picked it up," he said. "I know." "I'm picking it up now," he said. She understood that he wasn't talking about a key. She held his hand a little more firmly. "I know," she said again, but it meant something different this time. Outside, the Virginia winter settled over Carter's Hollow, over the north fence rebuilt straight over the east field that would yield well come spring, over the 460 acres that a man had once called his kingdom, and was only now beginning to understand was simply and entirely his home. Over the barn where Garrison stood in his stall. Over the oak in the garden, under which a woman had sat one July morning and decided to stop pretending. Over the grave of every letter unwritten and birthday missed and fever endured alone. Over all of it, the winter came quiet and dark, and covering the way time covers things when the people inside them have finally decided to live differently. Nathaniel Carter sat in his parlor with his wife's hand in his and the blue ridge on the wall above his fireplace, and the sound of his daughter sleeping peacefully overhead, and he was exactly where he was, and he was staying. That was not a small thing. For a man who had spent years being everywhere else, it was everything. There are doors that get locked, not to keep a person out forever, but to make them stop long enough to understand what they have been walking away from. Some men, when they find those doors, turn and leave and call it the house's fault. And some men stand there in the early morning light of their own failures and decide slowly, imperfectly, with no guarantee of outcome, to stay and do the work of being let back in. Nathaniel Carter had been the first kind of man for a long time. He had decided somewhere between a locked door and a lopsided cake and a hand placed over his in the firelight of a December evening to spend the rest of his life being the second kind. And in Carter's Hollow, in the winter of 1817, with the Blue Ridge painted in autumn colors, watching over a room that had been empty for too long and was finally completely full, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing, and he knew it now, and he was not going to forget it again.